Dirty Money Moves Season 3 looks into Tracy Hutsona, a self-described winner with businesses, mansions, luxury cars, a lengthy acting and modeling career, and an alleged romance with Keanu Reeves. But we're fact-checking these details, and the math ain't mathin'. You see, not much about Tracy Hutsona seems to be real, except maybe her abilities as a con artist. Listen to Dirty Money Moves Women in White-Collar Crime in any podcast player.
Criminology is a true crime podcast that may contain discussion about violent or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 331 of the Criminology podcast. This is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
Mr. Morford, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty good. This week has been pretty uneventful compared to my last several weeks, so I'm not complaining. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Had a good week, and you and I are taping towards the end of it, but I don't think it'll go bad, in the last couple days. So, yeah, good week.
Yeah, you got to take the good weeks when you get them.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead and give our Patreon shout outs. We had Anna Forsyth, Carol Musamechi, and Mary D. So that's a lot of great new support. We really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone that takes the time to support the show. It means a lot to us. For anyone else that would like to, you can do so by going to patreon.com/criminology.
All right, we're wasting no time. We're getting right into this episode. And this week, we're not just talking about one case, but rather two unrelated murders from 2001 that baffled investigators for many years until they were able to use genetic genealogy to reanalyze old evidence from the cases. We're discussing the murders of Leslie Preer and Christine Franke.
On May 2nd, 2001, Leslie Preer didn't show up for work. At the time, the 50-year-old mother was living with her husband in a cute 2-story brick house on Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, Maryland, that they moved into in 1982. It was normal for her to take public transportation to commute, but she was always on time for her shift at Specialties Incorporated, the advertising production firm where she worked. She was due to start at 10 a.m., but that day, she didn't show up, and there was no word from her. After realizing that she wasn't just running a little bit late, her employer, Brett Reedy, started calling her family members to see if everything was okay and if she'd be coming in.
Leslie's husband, Carl Preer, was at work. He hadn't seen her since 7:45 that morning when he said goodbye to her as he was leaving for work. Her 23-year-old daughter, Lauren, who didn't live with her parents at the time, didn't know where her mom was either, and she hadn't heard from her. It was unusual on Leslie's part, and they all started to worry about her. Leslie had to walk to her bus stop, and something could have happened to her on the way there or even while she was on the bus. Carl headed home from work, and Brett Reedy also rushed over to try to check on Leslie. Carl and Brad arrived there at the same time and slowly made their way inside. As soon as they entered the house, they knew something was wrong. So we have a scenario here, Morph, that we do see a lot in many of our cases. You have someone who is responsible, is known to show up to work on time, is never late. All of a sudden, their normal routine is broken. And those around them, family members, in this case, even her employer, start to worry. What we've seen some of, but, I've never experienced myself, is an employer actually being so worried that they go to an employee's house to check on them. I mean, I've managed a lot of people over the years, and never once have I gone to an employee's house if they didn't call in. And maybe this was a small operation. I have no idea. Maybe they were pretty close, but that, although it does happen, in my world is not the norm.
Yeah, I think that just shows how reliable Leslie was and she wasn't the type of person that was late all the time or just took off without calling in. When she was missing, it stood out enough that they wanted to go check on her.
And I think the other thing that you have here is, Leslie's husband and her daughter. Well, they don't know where she is. Why would they? Right? When everybody kind of leaves the house in the morning, and granted, her daughter Lauren didn't live with them at the time, but that's normally the last time that you see people, and everybody's headed off either to school or to work or wherever they're going. There's not always kind of a check-in. Most people just assume that, their spouse or whoever it is made it to where they were going that morning. Maybe they're going to talk later on in the day. So, a big shock, I'm sure, for Carl to find out that Leslie didn't show up for work.
Yeah, and this was 2001, so there were cell phones, although I don't know if Leslie had one, but there definitely wasn't the very common apps and things that you could use to track someone, social media, different ways to try and see where they were at. At 11:43 a.m., Brett Reedy called 911. According to the Washington Post, he told the dispatcher, "It looks like something possibly happened." He went on to explain, "We just walked in the door, her husband and I, and there's blood in the foyer." Carl called her name and looked around the house, but didn't see Leslie. The dispatcher told Carl and Brett to wait for officers outside, since it appeared that the home was potentially a crime scene, or that there was an accident, and EMTs could need room to get to Leslie quickly. Though the blood was all downstairs in the foyer, Leslie's body was found upstairs in the shower. She was face down at an awkward angle with her legs sticking out of the shower stall. Her body was wet. One of the responding officers told the 911 dispatcher, "We're not fully sure what we have yet." More officers were dispatched due to a suspicious situation at the Preer home.
But I do want to analyze this situation a little bit. If you're Carl or any loved one who rushes home, worried about a family member, and you see blood, but you're told by the 911 dispatcher, wait outside. Is that something that you're going to be able to do? I think for a lot of people, the concern would be so great that, you would start rushing around, looking for that loved one, seeing whether or not you can help out.
And he had to be especially upset after finding the blood and the things that he saw in that house. So he was, not just a worried family member at that point. He's someone that had seen some of what happened in that house.
Detectives arrived and found no signs of forced entry into the home. The neighborhood was considered to be quite safe. Captain Barney Forsyth, who was the head of the Major Crimes Division at the time, told the Washington Post it was not obvious that they were dealing with a homicide. He speculated about the possibility that Leslie had taken her own life, or maybe even reacted badly to a medication. It could also have been an accident where she was trying to make it to the bathroom to rinse blood off of herself and somehow fell into the shower. Apparently, no evidence was removed from the home that day. And I found this to be quite odd, based on, some of the stuff that the 911 dispatcher said. Wait outside. This could be a crime scene. Well, officers get there and then, they find Leslie's body. You would think, just out of precaution, they would treat it as a crime scene and at least collect evidence.
Yeah, it's definitely a suspicious death, and you can always go back later if you deem that it's accidental or suicide or whatever it may be, and change it to that. But I think the standard procedure is to treat a suspicious death like it may be a homicide at first, and then adjust it from there. So it is kind of surprising that they didn't take any kind of evidence that day from the house. An autopsy would reveal that Leslie's death was no accident. She had been strangled and suffered blunt force trauma to her head. 2 days after her death, investigators removed the frame from the front door to try to find any fingerprints the killer may have left behind. Investigators remained mostly tight-lipped, but did disclose to the Washington Post that it was a pretty brutal crime scene. It appeared that Leslie had fought back against her attacker, Male DNA was recovered from underneath Leslie's fingernails, but it didn't match anyone in any criminal database, and it also didn't match anyone close to Leslie. According to the Washington Post, everyone who was interviewed had their DNA taken, and all these samples were compared and eliminated, excluding them as suspects.
There were signs of a struggle and also signs that Leslie's killer attempted to clean up the crime scene. A rug from the foyer had been moved into the living room. It was covered in blood. An end table in the home had obviously been bumped into. It had been knocked over. There was a small puddle of water on the floor in the foyer area where blood leading to the stairs had been wiped up. There was a blood spatter and smeared blood on the walls. It became clear that the blunt force trauma to Leslie's head came from the foyer floor and the baseboard molding. Investigators believe that she was moved to the shower so that the killer could try to rinse off her body. There was also blood found in a trash can on the back door and in both the kitchen and downstairs bathroom sinks. The DNA from blood on the kitchen door that led to the Preers' backyard, blood under the dining room baseboard, and on the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room matched the DNA found under Leslie's fingernails. Somehow, Leslie's killer injured himself at the scene.
Detectives discovered that a neighbor who was putting one of her children in the car on their way to school that morning witnessed Carl Preer leaving the house. At the time, he was calling back inside to someone that the neighbor assumed was Leslie. This was around 7:25 a.m. A different neighbor was outside for most of the morning with the children she was babysitting while they were playing in her yard. She didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Police were at a loss as to how someone had come and gone from the home that morning without being seen by neighbors.
Leslie's murder marked the sixth homicide of a woman in Montgomery County in 18 months, and they were all unsolved as of May 2001. But investigators didn't believe any of the murders were related. Police Chief Charles Moose, hoping to reassure the general public, told the Washington Post, "There is no serial. There is no panic." He also warned people not to get involved, saying, "We don't want there to be any inference." And on a side note, if Chief Moose's name sounds familiar, it's because he would become well known for his role being in charge of stopping the DC sniper attacks the following year in 2002. But I want to talk about, what he said to the Washington Post. There's no serial killer. There is no panic. We don't want people inferring things about these 6 homicides. Well, okay, you can say that, but it's going to be pretty tough for people not to have some type of panic, especially women, if you have a large number of unsolved homicides.
So you have this county that has these 6 homicides, but this particular neighborhood is supposed to be a safe one. So the fact they have one of these murders there undoubtedly set off alarm bells for people living there. Despite DNA being obtained from Leslie's killer, her case went cold. For years, her family hoped for answers. Leslie's husband, Carl Preer, passed away in 2017 without ever finding out who killed his wife. The official cause of his death was septic shock, but his daughter Lauren believes he died of a broken heart. Leslie's murder caused Lauren to become more vigilant and want to be able to protect herself. She bought a 9mm Taurus pistol and carried pepper spray with her at all times in her purse. She didn't want to wind up being a victim of a violent crime.
And Morf, sometimes it's the fallout from some of these murders that you don't always hear everything about. I mean, obviously there's going to be grief and sorrow, but Carl passed away. He was still fairly young. I don't know if you can die of a broken heart necessarily, but his life obviously was altered completely. And then you have Lauren, whose life was as well, but she became extra vigilant because of what happened to her mother. And I think a lot of family members probably do. An incident like this happens and it just changes everything in your world.
You definitely can't blame her for being affected by this and wanting to protect herself. But I feel bad for her that she probably had this sense that whoever did this to her mom might one day come for her.
In 2022, authorities renewed the investigation into Leslie's murder. Detective Tara Bayonne from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office told Fox 5 DC the investigators were reaching out to the public to see if maybe there's some information out there that maybe someone didn't want to provide earlier. Someone had a change of heart, or, 21 years is a long time. There could have been confessions made, or it's possible that someone wanted to unburden themselves. There was also a reward of up to $10,000 being offered for information that led to the arrest of the suspect or suspects responsible for Leslie's murder. Leslie's daughter, Lauren, told Fox 5 DC, somebody knows something and just come forward. Despite Leslie's killer remaining unidentified for over 2 decades, Lauren had a warning for the killer. You're going to get caught. One day or time, something's going to come out. Detective Tara Bayonne described the crime scene with fresh eyes to AOL.com as pretty brutal with a lot of blood, and said that authorities were puzzled because, as she put it, you would just expect for someone to have seen or heard something during the murder. Somehow, no one saw a thing. And this was something that, you touched on earlier, Morf. There were people out in the neighborhood during the time that the murder occurred. And as, you think about this crime scene and the amount of blood involved, it is puzzling, as it was to investigators. How did someone gain entry to the home? How did they leave without being spotted? And obviously, you would think at the time that they left, they would have been most likely covered in blood.
Yeah, it is surprising that neither the neighbors that were around that day saw anything. And I think most of us probably don't want nosy neighbors, but I think a lot of us like the idea of neighbors that are going to just look out to see if anything is out of the ordinary, for you, and you do the same for them. And, these neighbors that were there just didn't see anything, and that may have helped the case along if they had.
But does it also speak to the perpetrator being careful, maybe exiting through the back door where there was less chance that he would be seen?
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, protect.gov.
Investigators now were not just looking at the case with fresh eyes. They had science on their side and some huge advancements on the DNA front. In 2018, forensic genealogy had helped ID the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, and several other agencies had cleared long unsolved cases using genealogy. Detectives in Leslie's case felt it was time to try that same technology, and in September 2022, they sent blood evidence collected from the Preer home to Othram Labs for analysis. Once they had the killer's DNA profile, they sent it to Family Tree DNA database. Using genetic genealogy, investigators were given the last name, Gilgore, for their suspect. They had a name to work with, but the work didn't stop there. Nicholas Augustine, Assistant Chief of Police, told DC News Now, once detectives get that information in forensic genealogy, they actually have to do a lot of tedious work through like a family tracing to develop a potential suspect or a linkage to a potential family member.
And it's no secret, Morph, that you and I have been fascinated with the genetic genealogy approach and its results for, quite a few years now. Heck, we did a whole season on cases solved using genetic genealogy. I just think it's an amazing crime-fighting tool.
Yeah, and I think detectives in this case were excited when they saw that it worked and they wanted to try it, and they decided it was worth the effort.
Detective Tara Augustine discovered an old tip in the Leslie Preer case file on June 2nd, 2024. The tip was about one of the 2 Gilgore boys living near the Preers' home, and it had been called in about 9 months after Leslie was killed. The tipster was a former neighbor of the Gilgore home who was suspicious of Eugene Gilgore. On January 30th, 2002, the neighbor expressed that they thought that he may be somehow related to the Leslie Preer murder because the home was often visited by the police due to noise and nuisance complaints, underage drinking, and drug use. It turns out that investigators hadn't asked Eugene Gilgore for DNA or interviewed him during their initial investigation. Now that the genealogy pointed to the Gilgore family, they needed to surreptitiously gather Eugene's DNA to confirm the connection. Investigators tailing their suspect found themselves at Dulles International Airport in Virginia on June 9th, 2024. They followed Gilgore until he finished off a bottle of water and tossed the bottle in the trash can. After he walked away, they collected the bottle and analyzed it for DNA. They ran their new sample against the DNA from the Preer home. It was a match. Eugene Gilgore was Leslie Preer's killer. Their suspect's DNA was not in CODIS, and he had no violent criminal record. Finally, on June 18th, 2024, 44-year-old Eugene Theodore Gilgore was arrested by the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force in Washington, D.C. He was 21 years old at the time of Leslie's murder. Lauren Preer was quoted by AOL.com reacting to the news, saying, "It's been a hell of a day." Leslie's daughter, Lauren, said in shock, "He was my ex-boyfriend." That's right. Eugene Gilgore wasn't just a random neighborhood resident. He had a connection to the family, having dated Lauren. He had never been a suspect in the original investigation, and it never crossed Lauren's mind that he could be responsible for her mom's murder. When he was taken into custody, Gilgore was wearing a stealth monitoring t-shirt. Ironically, he was an account executive at the home security company from September 2023 until he was arrested. He was extradited to Montgomery County. So it's amazing, right, that they make this connection, but then, you look back at this guy, and I think you have to wonder, Morf, why wasn't he maybe looked at a little harder back when the murder took place? It's a known fact that people close to the family are looked at. Well, if this guy was an ex-boyfriend, it does seem like he was missed. They took some DNA from people. Why would they not have taken DNA from Eugene way back then?
And just to play devil's advocate, I don't know how far they would go back looking for ex-boyfriends. Maybe if there was some history where he threatened the family or he had a known criminal record, that it might have, come up on the radar. Even Lauren didn't really think about him being, connected in any way to the case. So, just a tough situation. They just somehow missed him.
Yeah, and we don't know how long it had been since they had dated. So, there's some variables there. But, I think it's something to question.
Living with any loss is hard. And for Lauren, the loss of her mom was no exception. When the loss is due to a murder with the killer unidentified, that loss also causes fear, as was the case for Lauren. She told DC News Now, "I had someone who had murdered my mom brutally, and they were out there. Knowing that Eugene Gilgore was the individual responsible brought on a sense of relief, but it was also a shock." Lauren said, "We've known each other since I was 15. It was hard for her to believe that her ex-boyfriend was capable of killing anyone. She never experienced anything that would make her think he could do something like that. She said, he was always gentle and sweet. Never saw him in a fight. He was never mean to me. But there was a time around 1995 that Lauren remembered going to talk to investigators who were looking at Eugene as a suspect in the assault of a woman that occurred on a bike path near their homes. She went basically as a character witness to tell police that they had the wrong guy, despite him fitting their description. In her mind, there was just no way he was responsible. Her best friend joined her that day and said the same thing.
And I don't know that, this is all that unusual. When you're dating someone, and even if the relationship ends, if it was pretty normal, as this one appeared to be, I do think it would be hard for most people to think that an ex-boyfriend, an ex-girlfriend could be capable of murder. If you spent a lot of time with that person and you just never saw anything that even remotely resembled that type of behavior.
Yeah, it definitely seems like there was no glaring warning signs, at least that Lauren could think of, looking back on her relationship or the time after her relationship.
Aside from dating, Lauren and Eugene Gilgore grew up near each other. His family lived just minutes from the Prieur home. His father was a professor at the University of Maryland, and his mother was a stay-at-home mom who had once worked at the World Bank. Eugene was the youngest of two boys. Eugene and Lauren began dating when they were both attending Bethesda Chevy Chase High School. They spent a lot of time at each other's homes, and each spent time with the other's parents and were there for family meals together. They went on family trips and played board games too. It was all very normal and wholesome, with no sign that Eugene could be dangerous. The marriage between Eugene's parents didn't last, and their divorce wasn't easy, according to court records. According to the Washington Post, Virgil Gilgore alleged that his wife, Judith Graves, condoned the children's shoplifting, drug use, and theft of money. Judith didn't agree with these accusations. The boys, at least Eugene, were getting into trouble quite often. Records from the divorce show that he was expelled from his boarding school.
So there's clearly some things in Eugene's past that show he was capable of getting in trouble. Maybe not violent things, but the drug use, theft, shoplifting. There was a troubling pattern there. And I think, had there been violence mixed in with that, maybe he would have stood out as a suspect earlier.
Yeah, but I go back to Lauren. I'm sure she knew about some of this stuff. But like you said, this wasn't violent stuff. This was, I don't want to say kid stuff, because not every kid shoplifts or uses drugs, but a lot of people do, let's face it. Do you look at that and make the leap to, he gets into some trouble, maybe he killed my mother? And I would say that would be a hard connection to make for Lauren. So I don't blame her, on that at all.
Yeah, I think if he had a history of, confirmed attacks against people, or maybe was hurting animals, things like that, he probably would have jumped out a lot quicker than in the investigation.
Or even if he had been violent to Lauren, which by her accounts, he was not. She said it, right? He was gentle, he was kind, he was sweet.
After high school, Lauren and Eugene tried to keep dating long distance, but it didn't work out. Eugene attended the University of Maryland Global Campus from 1999 to 2003. After they broke up, they ran into each other a few times, but it didn't seem like there was any bad blood between them. They both just moved on and started seeing other people. It wouldn't have been odd if Eugene Gilgore showed up to Leslie's funeral, since the families had once been close, but he didn't. Instead, he took an impromptu trip to see a friend who lived in Portland, Oregon. This friend didn't even know he was coming until he was already on his way, and there was no real way to say no since he was traveling across the country. The friend thought it was weird that Eugene took a trip cross-country without consulting him first.
A few months after Leslie's murder, Eugene and his family moved away from the area. He did end up with a criminal record as an adult. He was arrested for driving under the influence, theft, and possession of weapons. He had also been a suspect in multiple residential burglaries, but was not charged. By 2015, Eugene Gilgore had moved to New York, started working in the restaurant industry, and he had married and divorced his first wife. Eventually, he moved back to Washington, D.C. and remarried. To those who knew Eugene, he seemed like a kind of person who was working on himself. He donated $1,000 to the D.C. nonprofit organization Community of Hope And he would often recommend that people read the book, The Four Agreements, a practical guide to personal freedom. Many of his friends did know that Eugene struggled with alcohol and regularly attended Alcoholics Anonymous. They were also aware of his stints in rehab. Shortly after her mom's funeral, Lauren ran into Eugene at a bar in Bethesda, Maryland, and he looked at her and said, "I'm so sorry."
Lauren told NBC Washington, "Never in a million years did we think one of our people could hurt my mom like that. She was just the most beautiful person inside and out. And she was not just a mother to me, she was a mother to all of my friends." Somehow, Eugene Gilgore fooled everyone, including Lauren. One of his best friends even remembered a time that someone approached Eugene and asked him who he thought had killed Leslie. The woman basically considered him an insider to the case, since he once dated Lauren. He looked directly at her, making eye contact, and said, "Your guess is as good as mine." He did it with a straight face and didn't look anxious or nervous at all.
And more, if we cover, quite a few unsolved cases, have covered over the years. And a lot of times, you're talking about, let's say, a killer, and you're asking the question, how do they go undetected? Well, these types of cases, I think, help provide some insight. Here you have a guy who doesn't confide in anyone about what he did. There's no one to turn him in. He's not acting strangely. He's not really doing anything to put himself on the radar. And like we said, even Lauren, who dated him, didn't think he was capable of doing this. He just seemed to blend in and go on about his life.
And I think we know there are people that are good liars or have good poker faces. And, here in this one situation, he's talking to somebody about the murder and completely fools them. He doesn't show any tells that he's actually the killer.
Now, there were some people who did see a violent side to Eugene. In 2021, his second wife filed for a restraining order against him due to his behavior, but it wasn't granted because, according to a Montgomery County District Court commissioner, there was no reasonable grounds to believe that abuse, as defined in the statute, occurred. She had described outbursts by Gilgore where he would punch walls, throw things, and scream in her face. The same year, Lauren Preer received text messages from Eugene's brother, who said he was afraid of Eugene and thought he was going to harm him. Lauren didn't reply to these messages.
So we know that Eugene Gilgore was Leslie's killer. So the who isn't a mystery, but the why still is. There's no known motive for Leslie's murder. As far as Lauren was aware, Leslie liked Eugene and had always been kind to him. There are some theories, though, about what happened. Since Eugene was named as a suspect for multiple residential burglaries and was actually charged with theft, some people think he tried to burglarize the home and found Leslie there, and things went sideways. The problem with this theory is that there was no sign of forced entry, so many people wondered if Leslie willingly opened the door for him. She was familiar with him, always liked him, and she probably still thought of him as the kid who had dated her daughter. She wouldn't have necessarily been alarmed by him or refused to open the door.
And I actually think that's a good theory. When you talk about no signs of forced entry, and we're assuming that the doors were locked. We don't know that for sure, but I think you assume the doors are locked and this person was let in. Well, where does that kind of lead you? And oftentimes it leads you down the path that the victim was at least acquainted in some way with their killer. And now we find out that, obviously Leslie was acquainted with Eugene. He had been over to the house a lot, during the time that he dated Lauren. I don't think she would have had any concern, probably, about letting him inside the home.
And I think that opens up the possibility that this was premeditated and he knew he was going to murder her because she'd be able to identify him, having known him so well. So I wonder if when he went there that day and she answered that door, if he knew that he wasn't going to leave her alive as a witness.
Sadly, we may never know why Eugene Kilgore did what he did, not unless he decides to talk. Eugene Kilgore has been charged with first-degree murder. He maintains his innocence and has pleaded not guilty. There is no bond. Because of how often he traveled, prosecutors argued that he was a flight risk, so he will be held in custody until his trial. There is a case review scheduled for October 25th, 2024, a day before this episode airs, at the Montgomery County Circuit Court in Rockville, Maryland. Trial is scheduled for January 2025. Eugene Kilgore is currently being held at the Montgomery County Correctional Facility. So this is one, Morf, that we'll definitely have to stay tuned to see what happens with this case. But as we wrap this first part up, in my mind, it's hard not to believe, given the evidence that we've talked about, that the prosecution is going to have a pretty strong case against Eugene Kilgore.
It seems like he'd have a hard time explaining how his DNA is under Leslie's fingernails.
Yeah, hopefully what does come out, although I don't know how likely it is what was the motive? Did Eugene know that Leslie was alone in the home? Did he go there to commit a sexual assault and make the decision that he was going to kill her because she would have known who he was? Or did he go there that day with the sole intention of committing murder? And if so, why Leslie? It's
frustrating when these cases are solved, but there's still no complete answers. And you have to wonder if, for Leslie's family, if that is something that, having justice is good, but having those questions unanswered, if that's still like, an all new wound or one that won't heal.
Yeah. Let's see what happens, when the trial occurs and what kind of information comes out.
Next, we're going to talk about another case from 2001 that was in danger of growing cold. And this case shows how complicated forensic genetic genealogy can be. Not just the actual process of finding the right suspect in a family tree, but also legally and ethically. 25-year-old Christine Franke was killed on October 21st, 2001. She had finished a double shift early that morning and then returned to her apartment in Orlando, Florida, near Universal Orlando. She was living with her girlfriend while attending the University of Central Florida. On this day, her girlfriend was out of town. When the girlfriend couldn't get a hold of her by phone, she got in touch with a neighbor and asked him to check on Christine.
The neighbor found Christine inside the apartment dead, just feet from the front door. She'd been killed by one gunshot to the head. Her wallet, which was empty, was on the floor next to her. Christine worked as a server at Cigars Bar, which is a restaurant at Universal Orlando City Walk, and she earned a lot of cash tips. It's estimated that around $300 in tip money had been stolen. At first, it seemed that Christine was the victim of a robbery, but there was semen on her partially clothed body indicating a sexual attack. Investigators collected DNA from this and ran it through their databases, but there was no match. Fingerprints recovered from the scene and from the bullet casing left behind also had no match in their respective databases. Whoever had killed Christine didn't have a record that police could find.
By 2005, a snapshot of what the suspect might look like had been created by Parabon Nanolabs using the DNA sample, and investigators knew they were most likely looking for a black male. But that doesn't really help narrow it down at all when you don't know the suspect's name or where to look for them. The DNA didn't match any of Christine's family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, or any potential suspects authorities could think of. In 2012, Orlando detective Michael Fields took over the case. As years passed, he knew that DNA might help provide answers, so he eventually reached out to Parabon Nanolabs and asked for their assistance in the case once again. Using GEDmatch, researchers found two of the suspect's cousins in the database and used their names to build a family tree. They ended up zeroing in on the DNA of a couple who lived in Valdosta, Georgia in the early 1900s. They had a lot of descendants, which complicated the process. According to clickorlando.com, the couple had 10 children, at least 42 grandchildren, and more than 40 great-grandchildren. Paul Hogan, whose DNA helped set investigators on the right track, said, "We have a huge, huge family. I've got like 650 fourth cousins and a bunch of second and third cousins."
Okay, we've talked about big families before, but yeah, this is a big family. You've got 650 fourth cousins. Number one, that's a big family reunion if they're having them. And then also, you're not going to be able to attend everybody's birthdays. There's just no way.
Yeah, and if you're an amateur genealogist and you just want to try and put your family tree together, you probably got your work cut out for you.
Well, and it's also going to make it much harder, right, to go down the genetic genealogy path. In October of 2018, investigators ended up at the home of Eleanor Holmes in Valdosta. The detectives told Eleanor and her husband that they were working on figuring out the identity of someone who died years ago. Instantly, Eleanor thought of her niece, who she hadn't heard from in about a decade. She wondered if this unidentified person could be her. The Orlando detectives asked her for a DNA swab, which could help them figure out if they were on the right track in their investigation. They also told her that her sister and her aunt had given DNA samples already. Eleanor, who was in her mid-70s, quickly let investigators get a swab of her DNA. She later told NBC News, "I just did it because that was the only thing on my mind, my niece." A few days later, Eleanor learned that her 39-year-old son, Benjamin Holmes Jr., had been arrested. His girlfriend called Eleanor frantic to tell her that her son had been arrested for Christine Franke's murder. His girlfriend called Eleanor frantic to tell her that her son had been arrested. Eleanor told NBC News, "When they arrested him, I knew they were lying," meaning the police who had contacted her about obtaining her DNA.
To obtain Benjamin Holmes Jr.'s DNA, investigators followed him. At the time, he was working as the manager of a Wendy's restaurant in Orlando. They ended up tailing him to a friend's house where they saw him discard multiple cigar butts and took their opportunity to get the sample. Testing revealed that his DNA was a match to the killer of Christine Franke. Detectives had obtained DNA samples from several relatives of Benjamin Holmes Jr. and ruled each one out, but they knew that they were on the right track and that someone in the family was the killer. Finally, Benjamin Holmes Jr. was a match, and police knew that they had their killer. According to Click Orlando, when Holmes was shown the warrant for his arrest, he became instantly nervous and claimed his DNA was planted.
Holmes's criminal defense attorney, Jerry Gurley, raised issues about how authorities ended up narrowing down the identity using DNA, claiming that it was obtained through false pretenses. It makes sense that investigators wouldn't be entirely truthful, and Eleanor Holmes admits that she wouldn't have been so cooperative if she had known why they were really asking for her DNA. She told NBC News, had she known why they wanted her DNA, she would have said, "I don't want to get involved. That's the first thing I would say." So there's no doubt that authorities bent the truth when they were dealing with Eleanor. They knew why they were there. They wanted to get her DNA, but it had nothing to do with a missing person. They were trying to figure out if her relative, Benjamin, was a match to the DNA they had in evidence. And I get it, we talk about people wanting to cooperate with police. You want to be helpful. You want to help solve crime. But at the same time, do you really want to be the one who helps put away a family member? Some people would say, no, I wouldn't want to do that. Others would say, if they had really killed someone, I would still cooperate because I would want them to face justice. But that's a hard decision, I would think, for many people to make. I guess, one of the big questions in this case is, what are the ethics? And did they cross the line?
Yeah, I think there's a long history of police flat out bending the truth or lying to suspects. They don't have to tell the truth. They'll say your friend's in the other room talking and you might as well tell us what you know, or, we've got X, Y, or Z that connects you to the case in an effort to get people to talk. And I think of when they lied to Dennis Rader, BTK, about, floppy disks. No, we can't trace you through those. And then he fell for it and he was caught. So I think there's a good history of police not being honest when they're trying to nail these killers. But I think this is a little bit of uncharted territory when you're lying to a family member in an effort to get their DNA. Do you have to tell them the real reason you're trying to get that DNA? And I think this is a sort of a new area that we have to explore.
Which always happens, right? When you have new technology, well, then you have new situations and questions arise that at some point will probably have to be ruled on by a higher court. Higher courts have consistently said that the police can lie to suspects, but does that extend to, a 70-some-year-old woman as they're attempting to obtain her DNA?
Authorities believe that Christine fought back against Holmes, thwarting his attempt to sexually assault her. Like Eugene Guilford, Benjamin Holmes Jr. was barely past 20 years old at the time he killed Christine Franke. But just like in the Leslie Preer case, despite knowing who Christine's killer was and having him in custody, they weren't sure how he ended up at Christine's apartment the morning she was killed. Assistant State Attorney Sean Wiggins told Click Orlando, however he found her, he saw her as a source of quick cash, an object of some sort of perverted sexual desire. He made the choices that he made that night and left a piece of himself behind. And then for the better part of 18 years, he walked free.
And I will say, it's one of the things that bugs me in these cases. It's great that eventually, using some of this new technology, the authorities are able to identify these perpetrators. But then you think about how they got to live 18, 20 plus years as free individuals. And that part kind of irks you because obviously their victims did not. When the arrest came, Christine's family was happy. Christine's mom, Tina Franke, told NBC News, "I thought they'd never catch him." John Hogan, Holmes' second cousin, who had uploaded his DNA to GEDmatch, was stunned. He told Click Orlando, "When you told me that my DNA helped solve a 17-year cold case murder, I just couldn't believe it. The power of DNA. It's unbelievable." John Hogan also had a message for the Franke family. "Just know that my family stands behind you guys. We're grieving with you. At the same time, we're happy and we're so joyous that you found closure." John Hogan has no regrets about his DNA helping arrest a member of his family. One interesting thing is that John Hogan, whose DNA helped find a killer, is fascinated with true crime and actually tried to be elected as coroner. He followed investigations involving forensic genetic genealogy, like the Golden State Killer investigation, and used GEDmatch for that very reason, never dreaming that his DNA would actually help authorities. He told Click Orlando, "I never in a million years would have thought I would be a part of something like this."
Yeah, it's clear that John is a bit of a true crime buff, and he was aware of GEDmatch in part because of the Golden State Killer case and other cases like that. So he took it upon himself to upload his DNA and maybe thought, on the off chance, I'm happy to help an investigator someplace on a case, and probably never, as he said, thought it would actually happen. But I think it's pretty cool. And I think that's why a lot of people actually put their DNA profiles in GEDmatch, because if they can be part of solving a case and some distant relative goes down for it, so be it.
But I think, like John Hogan, most people who do it don't really believe that, their DNA is ever going to really help crack a cold case. But I liked some of the things John Hogan said. I mean, obviously, a member of his family was found to be a killer. But everything that, he's talking about is, they're grieving with the Franke family. They're happy that they found closure. And he has no regrets about what he did.
In March 2023, Benjamin Holmes Jr. was found guilty of Christine Franke's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite being found guilty, it seems he took no responsibility or showed remorse. Instead, during his sentencing hearing, he maintained his innocence, saying, "I am not the man or the person who murdered Christine Franke."
So there are some questions surrounding the ethics, especially regarding the arrest and conviction of Benjamin Holmes Jr. Should police have really told his mom why they wanted her DNA? We know that police don't always have to be honest with suspects when they talk about the details of a case, but should they be when trying to get a family member to help provide DNA? It's likely that one way or another, they would have landed on Benjamin Holmes Jr. eventually, but discussion about how they use DNA in the case has led to some people feeling as though it was unethical. And I get that. I mean, anytime, you're using a ruse or you're lying, especially when it's to someone who's not the actual suspect. There are going to be people who are, going to, lean towards that side of it being unethical. But is it illegal? Because those are two very different things.
And I certainly get the concern that some people bring forward with that, but I also try and look at it from Christine Franke's family's viewpoint, that they just want that case solved, and the investigators were trying to get that done and give them some peace. So I can see this from both sides.
Yeah, I can too. As with a lot of issues arise surrounding crimes and the legal system, I can see multiple sides of things. But like I said before, I don't know if this has been ruled on by a higher court. If not, I think it will be at some point, because, some of the techniques are changing rapidly. As the technology changes, well, the new rulings have to be made about how you can use it, what you can and cannot do. And then as long as, the police stay within the legal limits that have been set, and, you can talk about the ethics of it, but at the end of the day, they zeroed in on a killer. And that is huge by my way of thinking.
Yeah, both of these cases had some parallels, but also some key differences too. With Leslie's case, it turned out that the killer was someone close to her family, someone that had a history with her family, and like in most homicides, was somebody known to her. Whereas in Christine's case, it seems from everything police can gather that they had no connection. They didn't know each other. So her case was one where her killer was a stranger. And most times that's not the case. Most people are not killed by a stranger.
But in the end, one family got justice. I think another family probably soon will, if the trial goes their way and the way that most people think it will go. I do want to go back to something that Lauren said. And it was, you're going to get caught. One day or time, something's going to come out. And that was pretty prophetic. And, as I've talked about numerous times, I do believe that there are a lot of people out there still alive who have killed somebody in the past and gotten away with it, who are nowhere near as comfortable today as they were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, more if you're someone who committed a heinous crime and there's even the slightest chance that you left some DNA behind, you cannot be sleeping well at night, which is a great thing because we don't want these people sleeping well anyway. But there's a good chance that some type of DNA technology is going to get you.
Yeah, it's great to see these two 23-year-old cases solved with forensic genealogy. And, if it wasn't for that, who knows if these cases would be solved.
Yeah, and I think probably not. You go back to what I think police were left with in a lot of cases prior to this type of technology. They had the DNA of the killer. It was in all the databases. They just had no match in any of the databases. So what were they doing? What could they do but wait for a hit? This new technology, they're not waiting on anything.
Yeah, and you just called it new technology. It's hard to believe it's been, 6 years since they used it to catch Joseph DeAngelo. So it's just so common now. And who knows what they're going to have, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. Who knows what else they'll be able to do and what other tools will have at their disposal.
Yeah, I still keep calling it new, even though you're right. It's been around for a while now. But yeah, I thought, these were two interesting cases. Now, we had a lot more information, obviously, on the murder of Leslie Preer, not quite so much on the murder of Christine Franke, even though her killer has actually been convicted. And we'll still have to wait to see what ultimately happens in the case of Eugene Gogor. But that's it for our episode on Leslie Preer and Christine Franke. If you love the show but haven't done so yet, take a minute, go out, give us a 5-star rating. You can leave a review. Also, keep telling your friends. Word of mouth about the podcast really goes a long way.
If you want to find us on social media, we're on X with the handle @CriminologyPod. You can also find us on Facebook by going to facebook.com/CriminologyPodcast. And you can join our Facebook discussion group, Criminology Podcast Discussion and Fans.
So that's it for another episode of Criminology, but Morf and I will be back with all of you next Saturday night with a brand new episode. So until then, for Mike
and Morf,
we'll talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone.